I'm Vladimir Putin. I'm an author, member of the board of the festival. That's not very important. I'm only here to introduce our main speaker at this year's festival, the author and historian Timothy Snyder. Snyder is a professor in history at Yale University, specialized in Eastern European history and the Holocaust. Snyder's academic career is varied and most international. The general public have met him and still does. He's a regular contributor to a range of publications such as the New York Review of Books, Times Literary Supplement, International Herald Tribune, and others. To most people, however, he's known as the author of a number of influential books about the great tragedies of modern European history in their time, and also as a backdrop for this crisis.
I should talk for about 45 minutes.
Between democracy and authoritarianism we experience in the world today. Personally, I would say that Snyder is one of those few historians bold enough to take on the really big topics. Not as meta-history, but as a true historian digging through the archives. And as each book coming from his hand demonstrates, he manages to appear authoritative and controversial at the same time. I'm happy to say that all his major work is available in Norwegian. Snyder gained international recognition with his book Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin in 2010, in which he sees the mass murders committed by the Nazi and Stalinist regimes as two aspects of a single history, a single tragedy that was unfolded by these regimes upon the vast areas between Berlin and Moscow, the Bloodlands, or the killing fields, as the Norwegian title translates. In his next book, Black Earth, the Holocaust as History and Warning, from 2015, he presents a new and rather radical perspective on the Holocaust as a part of a larger scale ecological panic, where Hitler, driven by racial theories, attempted to bring the world back to its presumed natural order, in quotes, on the ruins of crushed states. The following book, On Tyranny from 2017, was read by many as a warning against Donald Trump, although I don't believe his name was actually mentioned in the book. And with his latest book, The Road to Unfreedom from 2018, last year, Snyder has taken the final step and included his own homeland, the USA, in his historical and ideological panorama. As in Bloodlands, he presents a scenario of two powers, one authoritarian and one, perhaps on the threshold of becoming one, America, threatening the freedom of their own people and everyone between them. The question is, how did you get there? What made leaders like Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump possible? I'm very much looking forward to the speech, and I was asked to say that Mr. Snyder will stay after this lecture and sign. And several of his books that I just mentioned will be available here, not least his latest, The Road to Unfreedom. So please, Professor, the stage is yours.
Okay, so first, before I begin, I wanted to express my gratitude for being included in this literary festival. I seem to be one of the very few North Americans, which is clearly a bad sign for our empire. I've never published, at least that I know of, any work of literature or poetry. So for that reason, I'm also very grateful to be included among writers I know and respect who excel in literature and in poetry. What I'd like to do in this lecture is take the historical argument of this book, take this history book, which in a way is a very conventional history book. It's based on primary sources in lots of languages. It goes through a certain chronology from 2010 to 2018. It makes a general argument about authoritarianism. What I'd like to do in this lecture is to try to tease out some of the bigger thoughts that are involved, because I think some of these bigger thoughts also have to do with literature and also have to do with some common concerns that we as writers or as artists or as people in the humanities face today. The three big concepts that I have in mind, which I'm going to talk about before I get to Russia and America and why it all went wrong, are truth, time, and space. And as I talk about truth, time, and space, maybe it will start to begin to come clear, why things went ways that many of us didn't expect. So let me first make an argument about truth. And this, of course, is a very conservative portion of the lecture, because I'm going to claim that not only that there is truth, but that we should care about it, which throws us way back into other centuries, like the 20th, which I realize was a long time ago. And more than that, I'm going to argue that truth has a fruitful mutual relationship with democracy. That is, or to put it negatively, that it's very hard to imagine how democracy could work without some concept of truth, without some practical agreement that there are true things out there which citizens and individuals can together pursue. And I think this is true pretty much regardless of what your notion of democracy is. If you think democracy is just a way that different people or groups pursue their interests, it's very hard for them to know what their interests are if there isn't a factual world out there. If you think democracy is like Habermas says, if you think democracy is just a big conversation in the public sphere, well, what is it that we're supposed to talk about? What are the things that actually give us a subject to talk about? The real world. That's the thing that we have to talk about. If we don't actually have a factual world, then we are not brought together to talk about anything. If there's not a factual world, we will always see ourselves as always right and always wrong. It's only the factual world which gives a chance for there to be some kind of approach in the public sphere, as opposed to the division of the public sphere into irreversibly opposed blocks of people. If you think democracy is mainly about the rule of law, which is a view I'm close to, you can't have law without facts. No matter what your legal tradition is, your legal tradition depends upon findings of fact. If nobody believes in facts, you can't have findings of facts. Or if you think that democracy is about institutions, institutions, whether in the private or in the public sector, institutions also depend upon facts. It's very hard to have a labor union without some notion of factuality. It's very hard to have a government institution without some notion of factuality. So if we go this far, let me then try, in what I hope is a comprehensible literary move, let me then try to say something about a couple of words and how their meanings have changed in the last 15 years or so. The first is the word information. And by the way, apologies for doing this in the hegemonic language. What I'm saying about information is actually true in all the languages that I know, and I suspect it's going to be true in Norwegian too. So not so long ago, the word information was connected to human beings, and it was connected to truth. It had to do with the verb inform. So you inform me of something, I am informed, and we assume that in that exchange, something which is true has actually been conveyed. That's implicit in the notion of information. Information is a process that includes two or more people in which something true is passed on from one person to another. You might have noticed now that that is no longer what information means. If we use the word information, we almost always now mean something digital, something quantitative, right? By information, we mean the number of bits that that digital systems need in order to communicate, not so much with us, we're just parts of the larger system, but with one another. So to try to bring this home, I realize that France is the subject of the festival this year, so I'm going to try to only cite French philosophers, like I already cited Habermas. Ugh, okay, I already messed it up. But that was just en passant. All of my deliberate citations will be of French philosophers, I promise. But if you flew Air France to get here, you should be aware that the airplanes of Air France collect digitally as much information about their passengers while their passengers are on board those airplanes each year as is contained in the entire Library of Congress, right, which is the biggest library in the world. But So, first you should feel a little bit creeped out that every time you get on an airplane, the airplane is collecting information about how much you breathe and what your body temperature is and how much you weigh and so on and so forth. Your car does the same thing, by the way, as I'm sure you all know because you're Europeans and you have laws about this, whereas in America it's just total Wild West anarchy. But your car actually, you know this, right? Your car measures if you gain weight, and it records that information forever. And I'm not sure if you have laws about this. We certainly don't. In any event, but here's the interesting thing. The information collected by Air France about its passengers, if you knew all of that information, you would be an idiot, right? Whereas if you knew all the information in the Library of Congress, you would be a genius, right? Because they're two different kinds of information, right? The information that is collected by digital entities is overwhelming in its quantity. It's lifeless. It's lifeless, but it's also deathless. It never dies. It's there forever, or until the planet ceases to exist or we run out of energy. It's without context, right? So maybe you did gain a couple of. Maybe I just did go to the cafe next door and eat that chocolate thing with the seeds on top that looked really good, and I gained 1 kilogram. I have a context, right? But my car doesn't care about my context. My car just ruthlessly passes on this information. We have contexts, right? Good context, bad contexts. There's no information which doesn't include some human emotion or some human interest around it. Whereas the information that's collected about us is contextless. It doesn't have those contexts. Or, and here's where things get interesting politically, it can be taken out of its original context and recontextualized. So now let me give you an example which is true and which comes from politics and which probably changed world history. In the 2016 American presidential elections, which you may remember, they were quite interesting in a number of ways. The Russian military intelligence got hold of the emails of a number of operatives of the American Democratic Party, as well as the emails of institutions associated with the Democratic Party. And Mr. Putin, who, as you may know, is the president of the Russian Federation, had something interesting to say about this. He said, look, it doesn't matter where that information, note his use of the word information, it doesn't matter where the information came from. All that matters is what is in the information, right? So the idea is that if a foreign military intelligence organization steals the emails of a major politician and then inserts them into a new context, we should see that as neutral, because of course it is a new context. Something that Hillary Clinton writes in 2005 on an email, which is then dropped into your email box in 2016, has been recontextualized for you and with intent. And more interestingly, the context into which it is pushed is not only a different context, it is very often a new fictional context. So again, to give you an example, which I'm sure crossed the Atlantic because it was so spectacular, Hillary Clinton wrote an email once about decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is a sociological finding. What decision fatigue says, and any of you who have jobs or children or both will understand what I'm talking about. This decision fatigue says that at the beginning of the day, you're better at making decisions than at the end of the day, right? Which is simply true, right? So Hillary Clinton wrote an email about decision fatigue, and she said, wow, that's true, which was recontextualized into the story of Hillary Clinton suffers from a mysterious illness, right? Therefore, she's too weak as a woman to be elected president. Or take the emails of John Podesta. By the way, John Podesta's password was password. If any of you still have a password that's password, it would be a good decision to change that. Anyway, Mr. Podesta's password was password, and so the Russians were able to get his emails pretty easily. Some of his emails were then recontextualized into a fiction, according to which Hillary Clinton was in charge of a prostitution ring which sold sex with children from a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., which sounds ridiculous. Well, it is ridiculous, but at the relevant moment in October 2016, 1/3 of the American population believed it, right? So it changed the world, this fiction. It probably changed how people voted. It changed how people acted in other ways. So for example, one American citizen was so upset by this that he actually went to the pizza parlor with a gun and fired that gun in that pizza parlor, right? So information which is recontextualized into our human world can then change what we do. So the word information is changed, but I've already reached now the second word which I wanted to mention, which is fiction. So when I say that this is recontextualized into a fictional context, I mean fiction sounds like a bad thing then, right? Isn't that interesting? If we use the word fiction in the context of the internet, we now mean something very different from fiction in the context of literature. Now, I just want to point out how significant that is, because when we talk about fiction in the context of literature, the way we've talked about it for the past couple hundred years or so, what we mean is a work of imagination which nevertheless leads us to important truths, right? Someone else's imagination can help us, the readers, understand things that are in fact deeply true. Whereas if in the internet age, we use the word fiction, we mean something different. We mean something which is not true in and of itself, but which is also leading us away from the truth, right? So the meaning of information and the meaning of fiction have changed in this setting. That's what I wanted to say about truth and about fiction. You can think about this as a kind of re-enchantment of the world, right? The world is now full of fiction, but it's re-enchantment of the world without any kind of magic. It's a re-enchantment of the world in which all you have are enemies. I'll say more about that later. Second concept that's behind this book, that's part of the argument, which I wanted to think with you about, and it bears on the conversation I'll be having tomorrow too, is the topic of space. So if we think about politics in the 21st century, what is new about politics in the 21st century? It's a very simple point, but one thing which is new is that there just isn't any more space to conquer, right? The history of people like you and me, most of you anyway, the history of Europeans for about 500 years was the history of conquering the world. I realize that's not what you're taught in school. I realize that you're taught in school that your history is that you were nice nation states and you get along and you're an example for everybody else. But for 500 years you were busy conquering the world. And that's a very important point. Oh, I mean, not Norwegians. You were only busy conquering the part that you conquered. I understand. And the parts that you still have, right? I'd like to record awkward laughter. But this is an essential point about all forms of modern politics. I mean, it's very easy to be critical about what fascism says about space, Lebensraum. It's very easy to be critical about what the Stalinists said about space. We have to colonize our own territories, even if that starves people. But democracy has a bit of a weak point here too, which is that most of our democracies developed in imperial centers and were in one way or another dependent upon imperial peripheries where the democracy and the rule of law did not apply. This is true of most European democracies. It's certainly true of the United States of America. In other words, democracy depends upon having more space. In the United States, the cliche was, go west, young man, right? If you don't like it here where you have to follow the rules, we have a whole continent out there where you don't have to follow the rules. If you don't like the rule of law, that's fine, because we have the frontier, right? Which was true of Europeans at the same time with Africa, and is true of European empire in general. Now, the interesting thing about the Cold War, now I'm moving closer to this book, the interesting thing about the Cold War is that in the American-Soviet challenge, which of course takes place all over the world, what you find at the end of it is both the Americans and the Soviets are losing their ability to control space. They're both losing colonial wars at the end. So if you think of European history, the real European history, not the nice EU version, which isn't true, but if you think of real European history, the arc in the 20th century is that important European countries lose colonial wars and then find their way back to a Europe that they invent, first as an institution and then as a myth. That's the real story, right? It's true of everybody. I mean, it's not true of everyone to the same extent, but it's true of the French and the Germans and the Belgians and the people who start the European Union, the Italians. It's also true of the people who then join the European Union, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British. That's the real story. But if you look at the Americans and the Soviets, what's interesting is that in their context, they also start losing colonial wars. They also no longer have the technological advantage that allowed them to win colonial wars. For the Americans, it's Vietnam. For the Soviets, it's Afghanistan. So by the end of the Cold War, by the 1980s, the Americans and the Soviets also aren't able to pursue traditional colonialism. They're not able to conquer territory, at least not easily. And what's happened is that the US-Soviet competition by the 80s has turned into a competition about technology. So space still matters, but in a different way. What matters in the 1970s and 1980s is the ability to fill the space you control with impressive technological things. And in the 1970s and 1980s, the Americans, or actually the West, because Europe was very important here, the comparison between East and West Germany, for example, the Americans and the Europeans were superior to the Soviets if space is to be conceived in that particular way. So that brings us close to 1989. And 1989 is an interesting moment in lots of ways. I mean, we're at an anniversary now, so it's worth thinking about what happens when communism comes to an end in 1989. One of the things which is interesting about the end of communism in 1989 is that a couple of trends which were already emerging then, which have to do with space, get suppressed or marginalized or not noticed because of the big political story, which is the end of communism. Those two stories are global warming, which was emerging as a scientific consensus in the late 1980s precisely, and the emergence of microcomputing. Now, why are those two things so important? Because both of those things, just at the cusp of when the Cold War ended, which, as you all will remember, that's also when history ended, so nothing was supposed to happen after that. And something did happen, right? One thing happened. We stopped teaching children history, and now we're paying for it. So both of those things are very important because they both change how we experience space or how we apprehend space. So with climate change is the kind of last step in colonialism. You know, you can no longer conquer territory horizontally, but you can still dig under the earth and, I mean, I'm in Norway, right? Under the sea. You can still dig under the earth, under the sea, and you can extract hydrocarbons. And the way that has to do with space is that the earth is basically full except for going underneath. And then it has to do with time as well, because when you generate climate change, what you're doing is you're creating a sense of time which is pre-catastrophic. You're creating the sense that time is running out, because it is. Microcomputing also changes our sense of time. Microcomputing is an interesting technology because rather than filling up the three-dimensional space with big, impressive things, microcomputing becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until basically it penetrates us, right? So what because the trends, I mean, you can go into the technical stuff, the transistors keep getting smaller and smaller. Our computers are so small we don't notice them, right? We call them phones. The things we call phones have more computing power than, you know, anything that existed until a few years ago. But more to the point, we take them into our homes. We treat them as part of us. We plug them into our various, okay, I was going to say orifices, but that wasn't quite what I was looking for. We plug them into our ears, you know, we lock out other people, we hunch over them, we treat them as ours or as part of us. And interestingly, that technology, unlike technologies in the three-dimensional world, that technology stops time, right? So if this is the only thing I have in common with the Silicon Valley oligarchs, so I'm going to say it. I also grew up in the 1970s like they did, and like them, I thought we're going to get jetpacks, right? Since there are motorcycles and there are cars, you're going to have jetpacks, right? And then as Peter Thiel famously says, we expected jetpacks, and instead we got 140 characters. He has a point there, which is that rather than the three-dimensional world becoming more interesting and full of stuff, we actually have the same stuff that we did in the 1970s, as you might have noticed. What's happened instead is that technology has turned us back into two-dimensional or one-dimensional beings, where we spend our time with a flat screen, and we're mostly preoccupied with the things that preoccupy us psychologically. So the change in space has a lot to do, and I'm going to talk about this, with a change in our sense of time. Okay, now before I say this, let me say something about space and time and democracy, because this seems to be this hugely important. If I'm right, and democracy depends upon space, or it has in the past, what does it mean when you run out of space, right? I think it means that time becomes even more important for democracy. I think it means that politics starts to happen in time rather than in space. And if you think about this turn to so-called populism, which is a term I'm very uncomfortable with, but if you think about this turn to populism, the most striking thing about this turn to populism is the death of the future. That's the most interesting thing. That, in the 1970s, the vision of the future might have been naive. In the 1980s, it might have been naive. But there was at least a vision of the future. And if we think about the last 250 years of European history, since the middle of the 18th century, Europeans and then North Americans have been extremely good at producing visions of the future. In fact, the whole history of the emergence of democracy has coincided, and I think this is no coincidence, with the ability to produce competing visions of a future which is for everyone, or for a lot of people anyway, right? Which is in some sense a democratic future. So what happens then if you run out of space, I think, is that time becomes even more important than it is. And what I've been trying to say when I talked about the microcomputing and the hydrocarbons is that the battle for time has already been going on, right? For the past 30 years it's been going on, and we're just starting to understand the consequences of it, which is that the future has gone away. And if the future has gone away, then democracy is going to be very, very hard to put, let me just put the point in a slightly more polemical way. If the present belongs to hydrocarbon oligarchs and digital oligarchs, those are two constituencies who have no interest in the future at all. The digital oligarchs have an interest in keeping you in a state of kind of permanent fixation with what's in front of you, and the hydrocarbon oligarchs have an interest in you not thinking about the future because global warming, right? So if those are the two major constituencies in international democracy, if those are powerful people, and they are, then we may have a problem with the future and then a problem with democracy. Okay, so let me then talk about time. And again, what I'm trying to do now is to sort of stretch the things that we're all experiencing and make them clearer and put names on them. Because what's happened with time in the last 30 years is really weird. It's simultaneously very weird, and we don't quite have names for what's happened. So I try in the book to provide a couple of names for the politics of time as it's emerged in the last 30 years. The first is what I call the politics of inevitability. So by the politics of inevitability, I mean a view which should be very familiar to all of us. The politics of inevitability says the present is fine, the future is going to be like the present except better, right? Progress. If it looks like the present is not fine, if there are some facts which suggest the present is not so good, what we're going to do with those facts is we're going to work them into a narrative which suggests that everything is actually going to turn out better. If something looks like it's bad, actually it's going to turn out to be good. It's just a bump on the road, right? On the way to this better future. So we pretend to like facts, but we don't really like facts. We actually like narratives of progress, and we use the word narrative a lot, right? I mean, like one good thing I think would be if everyone stopped using the word narrative, except when they were talking about literature, then it's fine. But the fact that narrative has sprung the box and we use the word narrative to talk about everything, for me is a rather bad sign. So what the politics of inevitability does is that it weakens the humanities and the arts, because reason is instrumental. We already know what's good. The good is the present. The future is just going to be more of the present, so there's no reason to inquire or to create. We already know all the answers. History is over, by the way, and there aren't any alternatives. If there are no alternatives, you certainly don't need art, right? If there are no alternatives, you don't need literature to defamiliarize the world, because we already know there's only this one world. That's the way it's going to be. It's just going to be like this. What we're going to do, and this is a key word, is optimize. Right? We're going to just optimize indefinitely. That's the 21st century word for instrumental reason. The interesting thing about the politics of inevitability for me as a historian of Eastern Europe is that we in the 1990s, that's my Western we, basically did the same thing that the Soviets did in the 1970s. Brezhnev said the same thing. Brezhnev said, look, this socialism that we've got, this is as good as it's going to get. Stop thinking about the future. There's only one future. This is it. It's a kind of vague consumerist thing. That's it, right? And then when that system comes to an end, when that system crashes, what do we do in the West? We say exactly the same thing. And we say it in a very similar form, actually. We say, okay, your economic determinism was wrong. You stupid communists. How could you possibly think that capitalism would bring socialism? That's crazy. Capitalism is going to bring democracy automatically, right? So your determinism is wrong, but our determinism is right. And it's that determinism that I'm describing when I talk about the politics of inevitability. Now, the problem with that is not just that it's wrong. The problem with it is that it creates... Okay, Marx is not a French philosopher, and I'm about to cite him. Neither is Hegel. It creates its own contradictions. So if you believe, for example, that capitalism automatically leads to democracy, you're not going to worry about inequality, and inequality is then a problem for democracy. If you believe that technology, and this is a mistake we all made, if you believe that technology is automatically enlightening, you're not going to notice that technology, at least of the internet variety, is making you stupid. And if you haven't noticed that by now, So in these ways, the politics of inevitability disappoints, frustrates, it leads people to not see a future, and it brings them towards another kinds of politics of time, which I call in the book the politics of eternity. The politics of eternity is what's winning now. The politics of eternity is what we call populism. It's Mr. Trump, it's Mr. Putin. The politics of eternity is this idea that we're not going to talk about the future at all. And again, I can't emphasize enough how strange that is and how alien this moment is to the whole political history of the West. We have major political forces, including rulers of major countries, who do not talk about the future at all. That's very unusual. And then we have people within Europe, we have people who present themselves as challengers to the status quo, but do not have an alternative version, right? They don't have a vision of the future. That's weird. And what they have instead is national myths about the past, right? That's what the politics of eternity has. It has a number of myths about the past which pretend to be different, right? There's an American one and a Russian one, and I wanted to say there's a Canadian one, but the Canadians may be like a big asterisk here. I hope so anyway. There's a Norwegian one, there's a Polish one, there's a Hungarian one, but they're all the same actually. The story is always we were innocent and they were not innocent and they came for us, right? It's always we were innocent. I mean, find me a national myth which says they were innocent, right? It's actually kind of boring how similar it only seems interesting when you're inside it and you get to be the innocent ones. That's interesting. But if you look at the whole panoply, you see everybody claiming to be innocent one after the other, it's actually quite tedious. So what the politics of eternity does is that whereas the politics of inevitability weakens the humanities, the politics of eternity basically kills them off. Whereas the politics of inevitability lets journalism slide, right? Doesn't see journalism as very important. If you already know what's basically happening, why do you need foreign correspondents? The politics of eternity is actually hostile to journalists, right? Like Mr. Trump saying that journalists are the enemy of the people, which he's now said multiple times. Hostile not just to journalists and to the humanities, but to factuality itself. So whereas the politics of inevitability works the facts into a narrative, the politics of eternity says there is no truth. There's just your feelings and my feelings, and therefore whoever has the biggest spectacle factory is going to win, right? And so Russia has a very impressive spectacle factory. Mr. Trump is himself quite impressive as a spectacle factory. Whoever has the biggest spectacle is going to win because it's all about feelings, right? And of course, the feeling that you're likely to have in this system is that you were always the victim. So what I'm trying to describe in these two versions of the politics of time is what's happening to truth after expansion in space is no longer possible, and how there's already been a kind of contest for time that's been going on for some time, that's been going on for a while, that may actually characterize our historical epoch. But here comes the irony. We don't see the politics of time as a historical epoch, because if we're thinking in terms of the politics of inevitability, we think history is over. If we're thinking in terms of the politics of eternity, we think there's just this constant struggle that repeats itself over and over and over again between us and them. And in both cases, we've forgotten about history as a way of being in the world, to the point that we don't see our own moment as historical. Okay, so what I mean by the road to unfreedom in this book is this passage from inevitability to eternity. I'm really not trying to say that the politicians of inevitability are the good guys and the politicians of eternity are the bad guys, right? What I'm trying to say is that the politicians of inevitability make some mistakes. All of us, many of us, make some mistakes which open the way for the politics of eternity. I'm saying the politics of inevitability already weakened the norms of democracy before the politicians of eternity came onto the scene. I'm saying it's a kind of 1-2 punch, where the second punch is what finishes democracy off. And this is a very important point, I think, because if you fall into saying, well, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were right about everything, and Donald Trump is wrong about everything, then you are falling into the us-them perspective, right? I mean, it's okay to say they were right about most things. I mean, many things. But if you say, the moment you say, the guys that we like who lost in 2016 were right, and these guys are wrong, then you fall into this us-them politics, and you yourself are contributing to the politics of eternity, right? As soon as you see politics as just being like this, you're also contributing to the end of the future. Like in the US, if you think politics is only about Trump, right? If you can't get through a sentence without talking about Mr. Trump, if you don't have some kind of alternative, then you're actually contributing to the problem. Okay, you get my point. So, why is Russia so important then? Why does Russia matter so much? There's a reason why Russia is the first, let me make sure, yeah. There's a reason why Russia is the first word, although in the American version, we have on the back, we put America first. We did, but not for the reason you're laughing, but for the reason that we wanted to make clear that what happened to us in 2016 was an encounter between Russia and America, and that one couldn't just see, the Russians as coming to us and doing bad things, but that we, in some sense, were inviting them to come and do these bad things. So in the American version, and this, by the way, Norwegian publishers, this is otherwise beautiful and perfect. But in the American version, we wanted to make clear that it wasn't that America was just at the receiving end of all of this. So, but why is Russia so important? Because if you're if you're in the politics of inevitability, like Barack Obama, for example, you look at Russia, you say, well, that's a second-rate power, that's a regional power, they don't export anything, they don't develop any new technology, they don't matter, right? In other words, history is going to keep going, we know which way it's going to go, and places like Russia are just going to fall off to the side. And yet Russia got to choose who got to be president after Mr. Obama. So something is wrong in this calculation. What I'm trying to argue in the book, in the specifics of the book, is that Russia represents in a powerful way the politics of eternity. That Russia got somewhere before everybody else and is now pulling everybody else in that direction. So why is Russia at the center of the politics of eternity? Russia manages futurelessness. That's their problem, and they have this kind of solution for it. There is no future in Russia. I don't mean nothing's going to happen. I mean that more completely than anywhere else, the category of the future has been removed from politics. Why? Because Russia is run by hydrocarbon oligarchs. Point number one, hydrocarbon oligarchs, no matter who they are, don't like you to think about the future. Number two, Russia has extreme inequality of wealth and income, which means that social advancement is very hard, which means that politicians have to divert people away from the fact that their own future is likely to be like their present. And third of all, Russia has an intense succession problem. If you're bored with democracy, which please don't be, but if you're bored with democracy, it's worth remembering that one of the reasons why democracy is useful is that it lets you know that somebody else is always going to come to power after these people, right? This is the point that, okay, Tocqueville, he was French, this is the point that Tocqueville made in Democracy in America, that democracy produces the future and the future produces democracy. If you have authoritarian leaders, you know, for example, like Mr. Xi or Mr. Trump or Mr. Putin, people who don't like democracy, that creates a kind of momentary thrill. You know, you look at these guys and you say, "Wow, you know, they're breaking the rules," and it's sort of I mean, I don't find it attractive. But a lot of middle-aged guys do clearly find it attractive. This sort of breaking all the rules thing. I don't get it myself, but there is clearly some kind of masculinity failure going on here. But the point is that the breaking all the rules thing is only attractive for a moment, right? Until the authoritarian leader gets sick and dies. And then you realize what the problem was the whole time. And we're at a funny moment now because democracy is being challenged by these authoritarian rulers who haven't gotten old yet. Right? And the question is whether we have enough of attention span, enough of a memory to kind of ride this out. Anyway, Russia has all of these problems, which means that Russian politics are about future elimination or future management, which they manage to do at home by way mostly of television, taking multiple television networks, keeping a kind of superficial pluralism among them, but producing the same kind of daily distracting spectacle of us and them all the time, where the them are usually people who are threatening us very often in some sexual way. So there's a reason why homosexuality has become very important in Russia, not as a thing. It's exactly as important in Russia as it is anywhere else, and YouPorn has the data to prove it. But as a political concept, because homosexuality is a permanent source of sexual anxiety, right? So if you're going to do the politics of eternity, it's very good to use sex, because sex is a permanent source of anxiety, which is, as it were, almost completely out of time. Abroad, Russia has done something very interesting, and now we're getting to some of the details of the book. What Russia does abroad is it says, look, Russians, it's the same everywhere, right? So, okay, admittedly, at home, we lie and we steal. Okay, fine. But it's the same in Britain, it's the same in France, it's the same in America. Everywhere you look, there's no truth. Everywhere you look, the law is a joke. Everywhere you look, only power matters in the end. That's their story. And it's an interesting story, by the way. It's a new story. I don't think there's any example of this kind of negative nationalism before, where the leaders say, yes, we lie and steal, but it's at least our lying and our stealing. And that makes it better than other people's lying and stealing, right? So this is a new kind of competition. In the book, I call it strategic relativism, where the idea is that, yes, okay, Russia's going down, but we can make other people go down too, which might seem impossible and boastful. And certainly if you follow the politics of inevitability, you look at Russia and say, well, they don't, you know, they're a smaller economy than Italy, you know, they export less than the Netherlands, they haven't invented anything. If you look at it that way, then you think, how could they possibly do this? But then if you think, their entire cyber budget is less than the maintenance on one American fighter plane, Not that you shouldn't buy American fighter, I mean, go ahead. But if you think like the whole Russian cyber budget is in the tens of millions, or at the most the hundreds of millions, and you realize that cyber budget quite possibly contributed to the outcome of Brexit and very likely contributed to the outcome of the American presidential elections. And if you realize, to give you a contemporary example, more than half of the people who are going to vote tomorrow in the European Union elections have been exposed to Russian propaganda on the internet, more than half. And these estimates, by the way, always go up. So it's going to turn out that it was much more than half, very likely. In the US, we have 137 million voters in the last presidential election. 126 million Americans were exposed to Russian propaganda on the internet, right? So this is just by way of saying that Russia, it's not so odd to think Russia can affect the world, so long as the idea of affecting the world is to make things worse. Right, is to break things down. They're not projecting any kind of positive model, they're just trying to persuade all of us that everything's basically just a joke, forget about the future, there isn't going to be one anyway. Which brings us to the US presidentials. I'm happy to talk in greater detail about the question of whether Russia actually made a difference or not. I think it's pretty clear that Russia did. But I want to talk here just about the interesting way in which the Russian approach to the US is an example of how the politics of inevitability turns into the politics of eternity. So what Russia does is that it sees the weaknesses that we have in our politics of inevitability and kind of invites us along into the politics of eternity, makes it come a little bit faster. So in the case of the US, what are our weaknesses? I feel like I'm giving things away now. So the idea that capitalism brings democracy, that means that you don't regulate a whole lot of things that you should, and you end up with people like Mr. Trump, who are basically products of gangster capitalism. If you believe capitalism brings democracy, then you end up with grotesque inequalities of wealth and income, which we have, which generate people who end up voting for Mr. Trump. If you think that Facebook is enlightening, then you're not going to notice when a foreign power basically uses Facebook to pass on its message. Facebook, as I'm sure you know, was Russia's preferred way of reaching the American voter in 2016. And then we have the kinds of vulnerabilities that everybody has, that you also have. Like, we have the things that we're afraid of. In the US, it's race. So one of the things that Russia did in America in 2016 was that it took people who were racists, and they said, they told the racists that Hillary Clinton loved black people. And then it took the black people, and it told the black people that Hillary Clinton was a racist. Now, in the good old world before the internet, this might have been noticed, but in our current world, where we're all walled off from each other, there's no way that's going to be noticed. Because what this is a specific application of a potential which is available in the internet, which is it's something called confirmation bias. If you already believe that, I'm sorry I'm doing this, right? The camera can't see who you are, so don't worry. If you already believe that black people are inferior, and then the messages come through which tell you, give you more of that, you'll tend to believe more of it, right? And if you already believe that Hillary Clinton is a racist and the messages come through, you'll tend to believe that, right? That's called confirmation bias. And if you know a little bit about a target country, you know what exactly you're supposed to target. And then the thing about confirmation bias is that it then leads to polarization. Because if you think this more and more and more, and you think this more and more and more, it becomes harder and harder to talk in the real world, right? And what does polarization mean? Polarization means the politics of us and them, where we start to think our enemies are inside the country. We forget about policy, we forget about the future. We don't even ask if somebody's messing around with the internet. That question never arises, right? In 2016, with the exception of me and a couple other people, nobody's even asking that question. Instead, we fall into this notion that politics is all about us and them, and the us and them are inside the country. And what is that? That's what I'm talking about with the politics of eternity, right? And there's no future left. There's just this kind of clash between the two sides, which goes on forever. In the book, I give plenty of examples of this. Now, how should we think about the Russian intervention in American politics in 2016? You can say it's about people. Mr. Putin preferred Mr. Trump. Clearly true. He clearly preferred Mr. Putin to Mr. Trump. Mr. Putin clearly preferred Mr. Trump to Secretary Clinton. He said so himself now on multiple occasions. you can think about it in terms of people. You can also think about it in terms of Russia and America. The Americans got killed in a cyber war, right? That would be one accurate characterization of what happened in 2016. A Russian parliamentarian afterwards said, the American services slept through as we chose the American president, which I'm afraid has a good deal of truth in it. So another way to characterize it would be to say the Russians completely destroyed the Americans in a cyber war. But unfortunately, there are deeper ways to think about this. Like, for example, the encounter of hydrocarbon oligarchy with digital oligarchy. If you remember what I said before about these two sources of futurelessness, well, the Russian state is a hydrocarbon oligarchy, and the vehicles by which their material was transmitted is a digital oligarchy, that is Facebook, Google, and so on. What happened in America in 2016 is an encounter of these two kinds of oligarchy, but unfortunately, it can get even worse than that. Oh wait, I have to have a happy conclusion. I can see it now, okay. All right, I got it, all right. But unfortunately, you can see it as being even deeper than that, which is you can think, it's not exactly only about people or countries or even oligarchies. It's in some sense also about the machines themselves, right? Because a victory of a Putin and Trump is a victory of people who are climate change advocates, right? Deniers is actually not strong enough. They're advocates of climate change, right? They think climate change is good. So it's advocates of climate change plus digital beings who don't care, right? And the digital beings who don't care is maybe the frightening thing about it all. Or to make that point in a slightly different way, a lot of our Silicon Valley oligarchs thought that they were supporting Hillary Clinton, right? But their creations supported Mr. Trump. So who then is actually in charge? Okay, happy ending. If I'm right that democracy and history have something to do with each other, that would suggest that there is a bit of a way out to all of this. It would suggest that thinking historically itself would be a form of democratic empowerment. And let me just give you a very quick example having to do with the space, time, and truth business. Let's imagine that the history of Europe, as I say, is about the end of empire and the creation of the European Union, and not about these little nation states and their stories of innocence. What would that mean? It would mean that Europe writ large, I mean the European Union plus Switzerland plus Norway, okay, the Europe writ large is the one part of the world which has actually found its way out of empire and back into something which is not just acceptable, but let's face it, is pretty wonderful, right? No, it's wonderful, okay? I'm looking at you from the outside and I'm telling you it's wonderful to have healthcare. It's wonderful to have public transportation. It's wonderful to have sex. It's wonderful to have all these things that you have that we don't, right? It is wonderful. It's wonderful to have public education. It's wonderful to have welfare states. It's wonderful not to fight wars against one another. These are all wonderful things, right? But the point is, however you feel about it, because frankly, I don't care how you feel. Like there's all this stuff about like, oh, the Europeans feel like everything's going so badly. I don't care. No, seriously, I don't care, because you think everything going so badly, that's your politics of eternity, right? That's you saying, oh, there was some moment in the nation when everything, no, there wasn't. What you've got is the best thing you've ever had. And the reason it doesn't seem so nice is the absence of the future. Because it's very hard to like the present unless you can see how it's going to turn into a future, which is different than the present. Because people aren't happy because they're happy. Right? People are happy because they see how their present state of mind fits into some future. And the problem here in Europe is the politics of eternity, that the future is gone. So where I want to close is with this thought. If it's right that you Europeans are the ones who have figured out what to do after empire, that would also suggest that in the 21st century, which is still a century of empire, not if you're here, but if you're out where I am and everywhere else, it's still empire out here, whether it's America or China or Russia or Google or Facebook. It's out there, It's still empire, right? If you really are a post-imperial creation, then what that suggests is that you're the group who could actually deal with the problems of the future. And surprise, surprise, you're the only people who are. Europeans writ large are the only ones who are actually trying to handle digital monopoly, digital human rights, climate change, the issues that actually matter in the 21st century. That's actually happening. What you don't have, I think, is a history which shows how that's part of the European past and part of the European present. Since if you think about yourselves historically, that's not just a matter of looking back and feeling bad about things, which is, you can do that if you want to, but it's actually a matter of taking responsibility. Okay, that's where I'll close. Thanks.